Well, good morning. Good morning, good morning. Hey, my name is Jon Teague. I'm one of the pastors here at Two Rivers. Let me just say hello and welcome, and also to those of us who are joining online. We're so glad that you are with us. I imagine that we have all found ourselves in a situation where we are staring down a challenge. We're wondering, is it worth it? Counting the costs, thinking about all the decisions that will need to be made along the journey, trying to decide if we can do this or not. I found myself facing one of those situations this weekend. My wife asked me to clean out our daughter's bathroom drain. I have 3 daughters, and they all share a single vanity bathroom upstairs, and that is a recipe for disaster in itself. But for weeks now, my wife has been asking me to clean out their drain, and so finally I gathered up the nerve to go upstairs yesterday afternoon, and I've been putting this off. You know, this is like one of those things on the Dirty Jobs show, you know, and I just did not want to do it. We've been learning how to live with a clogged drain, but I got all my tools. I gathered up my nerve. I stood over that tub, tools in hand, looking at the beast, and I thought, we should just sell the house. I was ready to retreat. And I wanted to show you why. I've got some pictures that I was going to, no, I'm just kidding. Let's just say I thought I was pulling out dead animals out of this drain. It was not a pretty sight. But I did it because I was imagining all the times when I wouldn't have to be asked to clean the drain again. I was imagining that tub being able to drain quickly and smoothly. I was imagining all the greatness and triumph that I would feel when I pulled all of that junk out of the drain. And it reminded me of a principle. Great things rarely come without struggle. Clean drains, or whatever you might fill in the blank with. Great things rarely come without a struggle, without a challenge. If you're married, you know this. You're not going to have a strong marriage without some friction, right? There's going to be some fights along the way. There's going to be some hard questions asked. There's going to be some courageous honesty. If you're a parent, you know that as you're trying to shape and form your kids' character into being, kind and respectful human beings. Just the simple things, right? You know there's going to be some wars and some struggle in your house. If you are a business owner, you know that you don't achieve success or sustain success without some nights lying in bed, awake, wondering, are we going to make it? You know that you've pushed everything in on this. If you're in any position of leadership, you know that there's always going to be some form of opposition to the vision. There will always be people who will threaten to leave you for another. But it's in these challenges, it's in these struggles that we learn something about ourselves and about God. It's in these challenges that we learn something about endurance. Am I right, Doc? We talked about that. We learn about endurance when we stand in the face of pressure, when we go through trials that test us and we come out stronger, when we step out of the shadow of fear. That's when we have the opportunity to trust God and experience His power. Or we can pull back. We can avoid the risk. We can sidestep the struggle and potentially miss the very thing that God wants to do in us and through us. And that is exactly the scenario facing the people of Israel in the Old Testament book of Numbers. So if you have a Bible, I'd love for you to turn with me to the book of Numbers. We're going to be in Numbers chapter 13 this morning. If you are following along in our Eat This Book plan, we read this past week. But let me just set up some context for us to get us all back in the picture here. In the middle of Numbers chapter 10, you got the nation of Israel, God's chosen people, packing up to leave the wilderness of Sinai. They've been camped out there for over a year. They had been given God's law there. He showed them how he wanted them to live. They had built the tabernacle there, a place for God's presence to dwell with them. Last week, Chris talked to us about how God taught them how to make atonement for their sin or to cover their sin. Now, they're on their way to the great land that God had promised them, a land that was flowing with milk and honey. And you would think, if you were following along in this story, with all their experiences with God, the plagues on the Egyptians, walking through the Red Sea on dry ground, the manna from heaven to eat, the water coming out of rocks to drink, God's presence leading and guiding them in fire and cloud, you'd think with all those shared experiences with God that nothing was going to get in their way. Nothing could stop them. And yet, in the 3 weeks that it took for them to travel from Sinai to the border of the promised land, they complained about being in the desert. They complained about the miraculous manna from heaven. They complained about their leader, Moses. Pretty much like every road trip you've ever been on with your family, right? And here in Numbers 13, they're camped again, this time at a place called Kadesh Barnea. I actually have a map of this. Let's see if you can see. It's kind of hard to see, but at the end of that arrow, just to the left of Edom, you'll see Kadesh Barnea. They are about 20 miles south of Jerusalem. We know today that's it. That's the promised land. They are so close, they can smell the milk and honey. What will happen next? Numbers 13, verse 1. The Lord spoke to Moses, saying, "Send men to spy out the land of Canaan, which I am giving you. From each tribe of their fathers you shall send a man, every one a chief among them." Now, it's important we pause right here just to remember the goal of this mission. God's telling Moses to send spies to scout out the land, but they're not going to do this to decide whether entering the land is a good idea or even if it's possible. God's reminding them this is the land he is giving them. So then Moses lists all the people who will go on this recon mission. And then in verse 17 we read, Moses sent them to spy out the land of Canaan. And he said to them, "Go up into the Negev and go up into the hill country and see what the land is, and whether the people who dwell in it are strong or weak, whether they are few or many, and whether the land that they dwell in is good or bad, and whether the cities that they dwell in are camps or strongholds, whether the land is rich or poor, whether there are trees in it or not. And be of good courage, and bring some of the fruit of the land." Now the time was the season of the first ripe grapes. So I love this. It's super practical. Even though God is giving them this land, this is the promise he's been making to them. He's a faithful promise-keeping God, but it's still not a bad idea to go and scope it out, to identify the challenges that they're going to face and to make a plan. Verse 21. So they went up and they spied out the land. And they came to the valley of Eshcol, and they cut down from there a branch with a single cluster of grapes, and they carried it on a pole between two of them. That is a large cluster of grapes. They also brought some pomegranates and some figs. That place was called the Valley of Eshcol because of the cluster that the people of Israel cut down from there. Israel was known for its just abundance of grapes. I think I have a picture of a stamp from the 1950s. That was a stamp in Israel with that picture right there, two people carrying a huge cluster of grapes on a pole between them. Verse 25. At the end of 40 days, so they spied the land for 40 days, they returned from spying a land. And they came to Moses and Aaron and to all the congregation of the people of Israel in the wilderness of Paran at Kadesh. They brought back word to them and to the congregation and showed them the fruit of the land. And they told them, we came to the land to which you sent us. Now, I think that's interesting. A little bit of foreshadowing here. They said, so we went to the land to which you sent us. Why didn't they say, so we went to the land God is giving us? They continue, it flows with milk and honey, and this is its fruit. So no surprise, it's just like God promised it would be. However, their report continues in verse 28. However, the people who dwell in the land are strong, and the cities are fortified and very large. And besides, we saw the descendants of Anak there. Anak, really, people with long necks, literally, like big necks. The descendants of Anak. The Amalekites dwell in the land of the Negev. The Hittites, the Jebusites, and the Amorites dwell in the hill country. And the Canaanites dwell by the sea and along the Jordan. Translation, there are people everywhere. There are challenges everywhere. And you almost get the sense they've already made up their minds. As they talk about all the challenges ahead, you can imagine that the crowd is starting to gather around. They wanted to hear what the spies had said, and they're hearing about fortified cities. They're hearing about big people. They're hearing about all the difficulties that lie ahead. Just imagine how that news might have started to spread throughout the camp. Now, back in Numbers, at the beginning of Numbers, Moses tells us that there were over 600,000, I think 603,000 fighting men as a part of Israel. Okay, so I think that sometimes we think that this is like a small group of people that's gathered, maybe kind of like, a congregation like this right here in the gym, and yet this was an enormous crowd. This was a nation of people, 603,000 fighting men. Those are men 20 years and older. So some historians speculate that the total crowd was over 2 million people that would have covered 12 square miles. So that just starts to blow your mind. When you just think about the enormous level of leadership that it would have taken to move these people, and then also how news like that would start to spread like wildfire. Fear is contagious, and it's spreading through the camp. One of the spies picks up on this. His name is Caleb, and in verse 30, Caleb quieted the people before Moses, probably the people closest to this, wherever they were giving this report. Caleb quiets them down, and he says this, "Let us go up at once and occupy it, for we are well able to overcome it." And then verse 31, the men who had gone up with him said, "No, we are not able to go up against these people. They are stronger than we are." And they brought to the people a bad report of the land that they had spied out, saying, and now they're just doubling down on their report, "The land through which we have gone to spy out is a land that devours its inhabitants. This land swallows people up." It's like they're starting to tell this incredibly tall tale now, right? All the people that we saw in it are of great height. There are giants in the land. We saw the Nephilim, the sons of Anak, who come from the Nephilim. That was this sort of mythical race of people that were just huge. We seemed to ourselves like grasshoppers, and so we seemed to them. I wonder if you've ever noticed in your own life how unbelief has many costumes. Unbelief can dress up and disguise itself as so many things. It can disguise itself as responsibility. It can disguise itself like a realist, like, come on, let's be real here about all the different things that we're going to have to overcome in order to do whatever it is that we've been asked to do. Now, I got nothing against realists because I'm a realist. I can punch holes in a plan all day long. I can point out all the potential pitfalls. But the question that I have to ask, and if you're wired like me, that we have to ask is, are we trying to sink the plan or strengthen it? Think about these spies. In this group of 12 people, 2 men saw the same grapes. They saw the same people, the same land, the same cities. One came back singing in faith. The other came back with a sense of doom. What was the difference? We'll get back to that, but let's see how the people are starting to respond. Numbers 14, verse 1. Then all the congregation raised a loud cry, and the people wept that night. I mean, they are distraught from this report. And all the people of Israel grumbled against Moses and Aaron. The whole congregation said to them, "Would that we had died in the land of Egypt, or would that we had died in this wilderness. Why is the Lord bringing us into this land to fall by the sword? Our wives and our little ones will become a prey. Would it not be better for us to go back to Egypt?" And they said to one another, "Let's choose another leader and go back to Egypt." That's a good idea, right? Let's go back to Egypt, where we were slaves. Hey, we're wearing their jewelry. We plundered them right before we left. We took all of their things. Their firstborn sons are dead because of us. Let's go back there. Let's choose someone who won't lead us into these challenges. Why do you think they responded so strongly? We could just bust on the Israelites, but they're real people just like us. We've faced difficult challenges in our lives, and some of them we've stepped into boldly, others we've shrunk back. Why were they responding so strongly to this? I mean, if I'm just thinking about the Israelites, thinking back to their life in Egypt, they were set up there in Egypt. Even though things were hard, they knew Egypt. They had learned how to make it work. They knew where the good wells were. They knew the best merchants at the marketplace, where they could get the best figs. They had grown accustomed to that life. They had a routine. But it might even be deeper than that. I remember one night, our first year here in Ottawa, we had moved to Ottawa from Knoxville, had left something very familiar to start something totally unknown. It was totally new, this church. And we were scared, but we stepped into what we thought God was calling us to. But after several months, it got really hard. And I remember one night standing in the kitchen with Katie. The kids had gone to bed. Tears are coming down her eyes as we're talking about some of the challenges we're facing. And I'll never forget the look in her eyes when she looked at me, and she used my words against me. I had sold this whole thing like it was going to be an adventure in trusting God. And she looked at me through those tears and said, "This does not feel like an adventure." And I didn't know what to say, except to go back to that moment in time when we both knew this is what God is calling us to do. Because see, for some reason, we're all prone to the same unbelief. When things start to get hard, we start to wonder, did we miss it? Is God in this? Maybe we missed it. Maybe this isn't God's will, because all of a sudden we're facing challenges. But that's not exactly how God's will works. We have to remember that He's called us to something. At this point in the story, Moses and Aaron have fallen on their faces and they're praying for the people. Joshua and Caleb, the two spies who were ready to go take the land, they just tore their clothes. They're so upset right now, pleading with the people in verse 7. And they said, "The land which we passed through to spy out is an exceedingly good land. If the Lord delights in us, He will bring us into this land and give it to us, a land flowing with milk and honey. Only do not rebel against the Lord, and do not fear the people of the land, for they are bread for us. Their protection is removed from them. The Lord is with us. Do not fear them." I love this. Caleb and Joshua see that all the people that seem like giants and obstacles in the land that cannot be overcome, the land that devours its people, Caleb and Joshua are saying, no. That's God's way of providing for us. They're going to be bread for us. Later on in the story, in the book of Deuteronomy, in chapter 6, Moses is going to remind the people that God's giving them a land that's already full of cities. They don't have to build. It's already full of houses, full of good things that they didn't have to build or fill. It's full of wells that they didn't have to dig, vineyards they did not have to plant. Joshua and Caleb are saying, guys, you see these things like obstacles, but they're actually God's provision. And how does the crowd respond? Let's stone them. They wanted to stone Joshua and Caleb. But God intervenes. And in verse 11, God asks Moses, "How long will this people despise me? How long will they not believe in me, in spite of all the signs that I've done among them?" Just take note of how God interprets their lack of faith, their desire to turn back and stay in the past instead of moving forward to the place that He's calling them. He says, "How long will they despise me?" It feels very personal to God, does this not? Remember, this just wasn't the land of promise that He was giving His people. This was the land of purpose. God had tremendous purpose for His people. They were going to be a light to the nations, to the rest of the world, to show them that their God, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, Yahweh, was the one true God. And they wanted to turn back and walk away from that promise and that purpose. And now God's ready to wipe them out, start over. But Moses starts praying for them, which I just think is incredible leadership. And as Moses prays, God relents, but He does punish the sin of the people. And no one from the older generation, 20 years old and over, will get to go into the promised land. No one but Caleb and Joshua. And for the next 40 years, the nation of Israel spends doing laps around the wilderness as the old generation dies off. And as we'll see next week, the new generation, the next generation, inherits the land of promise. Now, what can we learn from the children of Israel? When they arrived at Kadesh Barnea, there on the border of a promise, they faced a decision. Will they trust God? Will they press in and walk in faith and face the challenges knowing that He's with them? Or will they retreat back to the past and to the familiar. Two different reports of the land, two different responses to the challenge. And all of it was a reflection on what they believed about God. If we walked right back through this story, I think what we would see is that the things that we choose to do often follow things that we say, which are often verbal interpretations of how we see the world, which all flows out of what we believe about God. Let me put that on the screen for you to understand what I'm saying. What we believe interprets how we see the world, which often interprets or identifies how we speak, and then that in turn turns into action. If we look at the others, the other spies, not Joshua and Caleb, but the other 10 who came a bad report, let's see what they believed. They believed that God's will would be easy. They believe this idea that God will never give you more than you can handle. Have you ever heard this statement that's not in the Bible? God will give us more than we can handle all the time to show us that His power is made perfect in our weakness, that we rely on a strength that's far greater than our own, that we can rely on others to help carry the burdens with us. But they believe that because this is getting hard, this must not be God's will. And so, how they saw the land was all the obstacles that they needed to be afraid of. They saw the giants, they saw the fortified cities, and they saw it all as reasons to turn back and to disobey God. And so they started saying things like, we can't do this. We are not able to do this. We can't do this. And so they chose to turn back. They disobeyed God. They missed out on the incredible promise of that land and all that God wanted to do through them. Their children, who they thought would become prey, would actually be the ones to inherit the promised land. And it all funnels back to a false idea about God. That with God there should be no struggle and no challenge. Joshua and Caleb had a different belief. They believed that God was not going to abandon them even when it got hard. They believed that there would be challenges in the land and that God would help them overcome. And so they saw all those things as opportunities for God to show up and provide, for them to see God work in incredible ways. Maybe He would remove the giants from the land, or maybe He would shape them and strengthen them as He used them to clear out the giants from the land. So they said things like, we can do this because God can. We can do this because God can. If God is with us, we are surely able to overcome it. And so what did they do? They took the land. They enjoyed God's promise. They saw God move. We're all going to have our own Kadesh moments. If we're following Jesus, we're going to encounter some giants. We're going to encounter some threats to our comfort, some struggles that really test our faith, and we'll have to decide, are we going to trust or are we going to turn back? But here's the good news. Here's the gospel. Jesus had His own Kadesh moment. On the night that He was arrested and betrayed, knowing that He was headed to the cross, He was in the Garden of Gethsemane. You may remember the story. He's on His knees and He's crying out to God, and it's so intense, He's sweating drops of blood. And he's praying, God, if there is another way, take this away from me. But he knew there was no other way. And so he pressed in. And he endured the cross. He chose the cross and all its challenges to die for us. The author of Hebrews says, for the joy that was set before him. Jesus stepped into the struggle so we wouldn't have to do life and all its struggles on our own. He stepped into it to empower us to step into those things and to trust him. And he stepped into it to cover our sin when we don't trust him. So what? What does this mean for us today? Well, I think if we went back to that chart and we cleared it out and we just thought about our own lives, we had a clear believe, see, say, do chart, and we thought about the things that God might be calling us into, this might actually be a helpful way to face the challenges. What do we believe about God? What do we believe about His plan for our lives, His purpose for our lives? The things that we sung about earlier today, that He is with us and that not for a minute will we be forsaken. It may be hard and we may walk through the valley of the shadow of death, but we will fear no evil because He is with us. So we think about things that God may be calling us into. The big and the small. Joining a small group. Inviting your neighbors over for coffee, to love on them and hopefully have a chance to share the love of Jesus with them. That might seem scary. Like there's all kinds of challenges with that, but what do we believe about who God is and what He's called us into as followers of Jesus? Maybe it's family devotions, stepping up and leading your family, pointing them to Jesus. Maybe it's praying with your spouse. Maybe it's tithing, giving your offerings. Maybe it's confession. It's coming clean about some sin in your life. There's all kinds of reasons why you shouldn't do that, but what do we believe is true about God? That when we confess our sin, He's faithful to forgive us of our sin and cleanse us from all unrighteousness. That when we confess our sin to one another, we have fellowship. We share something together. And we can be healed. What might God be calling you into in this season of your life? What are the challenges that are facing you? What are the giants you've identified? What's holding you back? And is it a lie? Is it a falsehood about God that might be keeping you from stepping into the very thing that He is calling you into? I invite you to bow your heads with me for just a moment. I want to pray. I want to ask the Lord to put His finger on that thing that maybe He's calling you to step into, to whisper the truth about who He is, because He knows there's a lie that you've been believing about Him. Heavenly Father, would you come and speak to us? We want to be a people who trust you and follow you. be a people who believe the truth of the gospel, and that truth would empower us and strengthen us and envision us to be bold and courageous, to boldly step into the challenges and watch you work. Pray that for our marriages, we wouldn't shrink back from the hard. In our parenting, in our relationships with friends and neighbors, and in our calling as followers of Christ to spread the gospel everywhere we go. May we be a people who are bold and courageous, trusting that you are always with us. In Jesus' name I pray. Amen. Well, there's one more thing we want to challenge you with today. It's sort of a corporate, a way to corporately apply this idea of taking the land. Something very exciting on the horizon for our church. And I want you to take a look at the screens.